So we all know about Cyberpunk 2077, a game developed by CD Projekt Red which had a lot of hype and expectations with 8 million pre-orders, ray tracing and DLSS etc. A game deserving the title of Game of the Decade, which ended up being an underdeveloped piece of disappointment. With a lot of bad reviews. Well, अब तो past को बदल नहीं सकते. Now there are some reasons about why this happened and मैं उसी के लिए वीडियो बना रहा हूँ because after all मुझे 169 सब्सक्राइबर्स वाले चैनल का धंधा चलाना है. All of this started way back in 2012 when CDPR came up with the idea of Cyberpunk 2077. The title was revealed on 19th October 2012 and after 3 months the teaser trailer was revealed on 11th January 2013. During that time CDPR was also working on The Witcher 3, so majority of the developers were already working on a game. Some devs decided to work on the story and the concept of Cyberpunk while the rest worked on The Witcher 3. And finally, The Witcher 3 was released on 18th May 2015. The devs could finally start the development on Cyberpunk 2077, but for some unknown reason, CDPR decided to scrap the story and the concept that they worked on for 3 years. 3 साल की मेहनत बर्बाद. The reason is still unknown, so it's an assumption. Maybe the theme and story concept from 2012 didn't fit in the era of 2015, so they had to start from scratch about the story. You know, that could explain the gap of 5 years between the 2013 teaser and 2018 trailer. Anyways, CDPR again started working on the story, and 1 year later, The Witcher 3's DLCs were also out on 31st May 2016, and the devs could fully focus on Cyberpunk 2077. This ultimately means that the real development started in 2016. After 2 years, we got an official E3 2018 trailer on 11 June 2018. The internet went crazy after watching the trailer, and the hype for the game started to get real. Thanks to the reputation they received from The Witcher 3, CDPR started giving out interviews and they mentioned this. These lines literally gives away the confirmation that the story is completed and fully integrated into the game. After 2 months, a 48-minute gameplay was released on 27th August 2018. अब तो पक्का कंफर्म हो गया कि गेम की स्टोरी कंप्लीट हो गई है, बट इफ द डेवलपमेंट प्रोग्रेस वाज गोइंग परफेक्टली स्मूथ, देन व्हाट हैपेंड? फ्रॉम हियर CDPR took some decisions which started to fuck up the development of the game. After 10 months, we got the E3 2019 trailer on 10 June 2019 with a breathtaking surprise. Keanu Reeves was in the game. Holy fuck. The internet once again went wild about the reveal. The attention and the hype the game received from the trailer was huge, but this time बहुत ज़्यादा attention थी, and excess of anything is bad. Since the famous actor Keanu Reeves was in the game too and started to promote the game, the whole world started to acknowledge Cyberpunk 2077 and expected a lot from the game, cause CDPR also made The Witcher 3 and the gaming community loved it. In fact, Keanu Reeves enjoyed his role so much that he convinced CDPR to extend his role in the main story. But there was a problem. The story was already completed and merged into the game. They could have added him in a DLC, but if that was true, he wasn't supposed to appear in the 2019 trailer unless he is a part of the main story, which he was. CDPR was left with one last choice: rewriting the whole game to fit him. The entire 2019 goes into changing the entire story to give Keanu Reeves the second major role after the protagonist. They had to borrow whatever they can from the previous story because storyline के बिना game का कोई मतलब ही नहीं है, and redevelop the game with new story. Plus they already mentioned the release date, so they had the pressure of the deadline. 2020 arrives and COVID happens. Worldwide lockdown, which means offices are closed and work from home.exe started. The efficiency of development was also reduced, which means finalizing the game before the deadline was impossible. CDPR still had to integrate the story and design the vast open world as they were only done with the story. They ended up delaying delaying the game for 5 months from 16th April to 17th September by mentioning that they need more time for fixing and polishing. At that time almost everything was being delayed, तो लोगों ने कोविड को ब्लेम कर दिया. They ended up delaying the game again in June from 17th September to 19th October. The given reason was balancing game mechanics and fixing bugs. Also, the toxic gamers forced CDPR to release the game using bullying, insults and death threats. The story was barely integrated on time and they still had to design the open world. So they had to cut content that they promised because developing everything would have taken almost 1-2 more years. On 5th October, CDPR said that the game has gone gold now. Fun fact, a game going gold means the game files are being burned onto the disk for consoles and is ready to be released. There were new ads and promotions and weapons/cards were revealed. Finally, the game is about to be released soon. And जब November आ ही गया था, we got this announcement on 27th October.
Oh shit, here we go again.
Another fucking delay. At this point, people started cancelling their pre-orders because the game has been delayed 3 times. And अब क्या पता आगे game फिर से delay हो जाए. Due to the delays, fans started losing the interest in the game and the hype started dying. There were memes about Cyberpunk never releasing. The memes were good though. People started whining to not delay the game anymore and release it already. Gaming community went insane. CDPR was under pressure about the unfinished game as they lied about the game being playable, and finally the game released on 10th December and it was a disaster. जो उसके बाद हुआ था, that was also a disaster. So here is the after release in a nutshell. Hell lot of glitches and bugs even on PC Master Race. Game was unplayable everywhere. 2 million refund requests because the game was unplayable. Only 8 days to be removed from PS Store. Absent on the PS Store for 185 days, almost आधा साल. 219 gigabytes of patches were required to be playable on PS4. CDPR got lawsuit case for false advertising. Hey, what the fuck? Data servers were hacked, source code stolen, loads of bad reviews, lost the trust of their fans and their reputation due to not delivering the promised content cut from the game and lying about the game being playable.
There was a misinput. Calm down! You calm the fuck down! There was a misinput!
A lot of glitches and unplayable. They can fix it, so it's probably fine. But what the fuck is lawsuit for misleading and false advertising? Aren't you the ones who started crying the game got delayed while we kept spamming this? And now you're the ones comparing Cyberpunk to GTA San Andreas just to prove that Cyberbug is worse than a game from 2014. Instead of supporting and giving CDPR the time to fix the game, तुम लोगों ने roast कर रहे हो.
God, this community is overreacting.
The co-founder of CDPR himself apologized about the state of the game. He admitted that it was his fault to release the game at all to protect the developers. They mentioned that they struggled with the slow disk bandwidth of the old consoles because of the old tech from 2013 to 16. COVID resulted in work from home and the efficiency reduced. पहले तो कोई COVID बंद कराओ यार. But for the compensation, they are giving us free DLCs and next gen console update. अरे अब तो खुश हो जाओ. Even on their apology video तुमको hate comments लिखने हैं. But from their point of view, they trusted CDPR with their money and ended up being disappointed. What CDPR did was also wrong. Anyways, this hate won't be over until Cyberpunk 2077 is fully fixed. However, I think there are 2 ways that CDPR could have chosen to avoid the mess. Alternative reality number 1. Keeping the old story and adding Keanu Reeves in a DLC. This would have made more sense as the story was already completed. A separate DLC about him would have been a really great idea, but there must be some scheduling issues and Keanu Reeves requested more role in the story, so I guess this couldn't have happened. Alternative reality number 2. Indefinitely delaying the game. CDPR had the perfect chance to do this when they were about to delay the game for the first time. Dying Light 2 did the same thing and अब तो कोई भी नहीं जानता कि वो game release कब होगी, but Dying Light 2 will be a finished and a playable game. In the same way, CDPR could have delayed the game till it was actually ready and finished and playable even on the old ass consoles. 1 साल ले लो, 2 साल ले लो, but release the finished and playable version. They underestimated the time to develop the game, and that was their biggest mistake. This alternative reality could have happened. Personally, in my opinion, Cyberpunk 2077 had the potential to be one of the best games in the decade, but CDPR wasted this opportunity by not delaying it indefinitely. Well, they did lie about the game being in a playable state to buy more time, and even I don't want to accept it, but the game will be fixed eventually. CDPR lost their reputation fighting 4 to 5 lawsuits and simultaneously fixing the game for us. All of this just cause of one game being underdeveloped. I want CDPR to release a complete edition or director's cut edition or something like that with all the cut content in the game. But to be honest, even if the game is fully fixed, the hype won't be the same as before the release. First impressions matter a lot. And that is it for this video. Finally, another video released in July, as I said, and surprisingly मेरी script सिर्फ 2 दिनों के अंदर complete हो गई थी. Do you think that Cyberpunk deserves the hate that it's getting right now? Feel free to write your opinion in the comment section. If you like this video, then kindly leave a like. ये सिर्फ एक click की बात है. And if you want to see more videos like this, and don't forget to subscribe. ये भी सिर्फ एक click की बात है. Do it. I get happier on gaining even 1 subscriber. Share this video everywhere. Literally जो करना है करो, but इस वीडियो को रीशेयर करो. And I'll see you guys in my next video on August. Till then, चुपचाप बैठ के उनकी गेम को फिक्स होने दो.